to AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, for another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you. I am your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for being with me today. If you would like to comment or have a question, send it to comment@am950radio.com. So, Brett, we were talking last week about Walz or Shapiro, basically, and we had both thought it was probably going to be Shapiro, but she picked Walz. What do you think of the pick?
Yeah, I was a little surprised by that. I was thinking for sure it was going to be Josh Shapiro, or even as my dark horse, I thought maybe even the Kentucky governor, Andy Beshear, might be up there as a pick. But she decided to go with Tim Walz, and it seems like a lot of people are pretty happy about it. I'm one of them. I think he complements the ticket nicely, and he'll be very good at attacking the likes of J.D. Vance and especially Donald Trump. So I like the pick.
Yeah, I think it's a good pick, too. And I watched, their speeches last night. And he came off as it was a pretty good speech by him, and they got to keep this going because now we're under 90 days now before the election. So, I had mentioned last week that if Harris was really looking at his record, as a progressive here in Minnesota, at least the last couple of years, he had a decent chance, I think, and I think that's kind of what it might have come down to here. So I'm just going to do a quick little review of some of the things that the Democratic legislature here in Minnesota has done the last couple of years, which I think helped his ability to get the vice president nomination. So, we legalized marijuana, kept abortion rights here in the state, passed some LGBTQ plus protection laws, 2 years of free college if you meet the financial qualifications, the free breakfast and lunch for school kids, and I think that's going to be a big part of the ads that you're going to see with him too. Paid family leave, child tax credit, the felons can vote now in Minnesota once they're out of jail, and even the gun safety laws. This gun safety laws, I think, was a big one too, because I was watching some of the coverage after Walz was picked, and I think a lot of the younger people like this pick in part because of the gun safety laws that Walz helped pass. So I think you're going to see him probably talk about that too when he's on the campaign trail. So I also think his background probably helped get him over the top. He was in Congress for 12 years. Down in the 1st District, which is a Republican-leaning district. When he first got elected, he defeated a Republican down there. And he's been through 6 elections down there, and then he's been through 2 elections here as governor. So he's, been through the grinds of the elections, and he's won them, right? So even in that awful year of 2010, he still won his seat down there. And rural voters seem to like him. So I think another reason why he was probably picked is I don't think the Democrats are going to win a lot of the rural states. But in some of the states where there's both urban and rural areas, like I think Pennsylvania, in the western part, I think he's going to help get some rural voters maybe switching their votes this year, especially in those battleground states. I think the progressives also like him, given his record, as I mentioned before. Again, I listened to some of the interviews and some of the YouTube videos of some of the leading progressive talkers, and they all seem pretty happy with this pick. So you might get some more progressives voting who may have just decided not to this year, but now I think you're going to potentially get more of those out. I think this was a good pick for a lot of progressives as well, because I think they finally saw the national Democrats pick somebody who's not necessarily a corporate Democrat or a moderate Democrat, although Walz is, at least when he was in Congress, was more of a moderate. But so they're pretty happy with the higher ups finally picking a progressive to be on the ticket. So he's also a pro-union guy. You know, he was a teacher for 20 years down in Mankato, and you know, the union people are a big part of the constituency of the Democratic Party. He's been in the military for a number of years, so this could help bring in more votes from that group as well. I think another reason why maybe he got picked over Shapiro was he did really well in his media interviews, going after both Vance and Trump and the Republicans. The phrase that he coined about the Republicans are just weird. I mean, really took off, and it still is. Republicans hate it, so, you know, if they hate it, that must mean it's a good line. A couple other phrases that I've picked up on, I think you'll hear a little bit more about, or maybe in a little different wording. But another thing that he said is that a robber baron, he's talking about Trump, and a venture capitalist, which is what Vance is, are not going to tell us what to do. And I think that's a good line that you'll probably hear being repeated throughout the rest of the campaign. And then last night, one of the parts of his speech that went viral was where he said, in the context of talking about abortion and people making their own choices, is he was saying, mind your own damn business. And also that one I've heard over and over and over since his speech. So another big thing is that he's a likable guy. I mean, lots of people were saying that. Even Republicans have to admit that he's a likable guy. One of his nicknames is a happy warrior. So, you know, even if you don't agree with his policies, he's still a good guy, unlike Trump and Vance, who just aren't. So I think he can help with the Midwest states. You know, there's some Republicans out there saying, well, Trump picked Vance to help with these rural Midwest states because he wrote the hillbilly elegy. Well, I think Walz can counteract Vance in these states. Plus, the Democrats raised a lot of money after he was picked as well. I did a little checking on this where in the 3 hours after he was picked, so he came, you know, the pick came out around 9 in the morning, and between 9 and noon on that Tuesday, the Democrats raised $6.6 million. And now, you know, a day later, essentially after he was picked, just heard this morning that number is now over $20 million that they've raised since Walz was named as the vice presidential candidate. So that's a good sign too. I think it shows that even more grassroots people are giving money, and I think some of the big money Democratic donors who said they were not going to give money to Biden are now giving money to Harris and Walz. So that's a good sign too, that the money's coming in. A lot of people, one thing that I heard a lot was, well, a lot of people don't know him all that much, you know, at a national level. But I think when they, you know, start looking at what he's saying, do a little research on him, you know, listen to some of his speeches, I'm sure he'll bring that stuff up, is I think the more that they know about him, I think the more they're going to like him. Unlike J.D. Vance, who the more you look into him, the more it just gets worse and worse, and the more you don't like him. So it might help the ticket, I think, that he's not as well known, perhaps, as Shapiro or some of the other candidates were. So the Republicans, however, of course, already started attacking him. And there's certainly one area that they're going to, you know, probably run something about every day while this goes on. And, of course, that's on the George Floyd riot response. You know, we've already heard that come out in some of their commercials and some of the tweets and those sorts of things. And Trump, you know, already lied about that during his speech in St. Cloud when he was here, saying that, well, I'm the one that called out the National Guard instead of Walz. Well, it was Walz, and Walz, had to wait until the governor or the mayor of Minneapolis asked him to call it out. So I am sure that the Democrats have a response to all of this. They probably had one even before Walz was picked. because they are going to have to, have some response to these attacks that are coming on this one. And they like to say, Minneapolis burned down during, this time. Well, obviously it didn't. A reminder that many of the people arrested, especially the ones that started the fires and did a lot of the other crimes, were not even from Minnesota. They were from other states. They were affiliated with white nationalist hate groups. They weren't BLM members, that lived in the area. So watch for this issue and watch to see how the Democrats respond to this, because they're going to have to do that. They've also already come out with their, he's a communist, he's a Marxist, he's a socialist, he's a extreme liberal progressive, all the buzzwords that Republicans like to use, for what was accomplished here in Minnesota, as I said earlier. They're going to attack him saying, he's going to raise your taxes if him and Harris are elected. And, they're already saying, there's going to be the open border, which they always say. They'll say that about anybody who's running against them. They'll also criticize his COVID response with the mask mandate and shutting down the schools and those sorts of things. But I don't think that attack in particular is going to work. I think the Democrats would love to have a little debate about Trump's failure on COVID and how over a million people died because of Trump's weak response to COVID at the beginning. Plus, if a lot of those accomplishments that Walz and Minnesota have done, if you pull those separately, just put the question to the people: do you support paid family leave? A majority of Americans do, even a majority of Republicans do, on a lot of those issues. So if they're going to, attack him on those sorts of issues, fine, let them do it. I think a lot of those issues people are going to like. Certainly not the hardcore MAGA people, of course, and the hardcore Republicans, but the swing voters. I think, let's have that debate about those accomplishments. I think that's something that the Democrats can win on. So I think this is a good pick by Harris. You got to give her credit for picking him. She could have done a more careful pick than Walz, I think. But now we have less than 90 days before the election, and this vibe now kind of feels to me like it was during Obama's 2008 elections, where the Democrats swept the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And we need to do that if we want to get our policies enacted, because if the Republicans take one of those, they're going to stall. They're going to try and stop everything that Harris and Walz want to accomplish. So we need to keep up not only the campaign for president, but also for the down ballot races as well, because we got to get that trifecta. And we saw how good a trifecta worked in the Minnesota legislature. So let's get it in Congress. So we got to get the work done, and we got to get everybody out to vote. So even if the polls say, the Democrats are ahead, you got to keep pressing on. So, Brett, another question for you. So do you think Walz is going to bring in any more people in to vote for the election, or do you think he'll just do what he needs to do to help Harris?
I think at the very least he'll probably keep more of that Democratic base together, which could have been a risk if Kamala Harris had gone and picked someone, I hate to go back to 2016, someone like Tim Kaine, who really didn't inspire anybody. So I think he'll keep that base together. And I think, too, there's a chance he could help in some of those rural areas where, maybe where Democrats typically lost 75% to 25%. Maybe they only lose 70-30, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in the margins, that could have a big impact. So I think it's a very positive pick, and I think he will have an impact. Not a huge one, since really I don't think anyone has big impacts anymore as a VP pick, but I think he could have enough where it could very well put Kamala Harris over the finish line in a close race.
Yeah, because, let's hope that this race isn't going to be as close, as a lot of people, at least now, are saying. But we got time, and it doesn't matter by how much you win by, just as long as you win. And the more votes he can get, from the independents or even some Republican, there's some Republicans for Harris groups now popping up, which is a good sign too. So you're listening to Politics Matters with Bruce Klopfleisch. We'll be back where I'm going to be talking about the Articles of Confederation. What is that anyway? Well, I'll tell you after the break.
Here come the jesters, 1, 2, 3. It's all part of my fantasy.
Welcome to AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, for another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you. I am your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for listening to the show. If you have a comment or a question, send it to comment@am950radio.com. So for this second segment today, I'm going to be talking about the Articles of Confederation, which is the civics part of the show today. So lots of people... You ask them, or ask my students, what was the first government of the United States, after they won the Revolutionary War? Some people talk about, it was the Declaration of Independence. Well, no. That wasn't any form of government, although it was a document that we declared our independence. And lots of people then say, okay, well, then it was a Constitution. That's another popular one, which that's not the case either. So it was the Articles of Confederation. So I'm going to go through that here a little bit in this segment. So this is something that, in some of my political science classes that I took, people skipped over. I'm not going to do that, though. I'm going to tell you about this because if you look at the Articles of Confederation and look at some of the highlights and also look at how it did not work very well, you can see why the Founding Fathers decided it's time to scrap it and go with the Constitution. And you can see why some of the things that ended up in the Constitution ended up in there because things just got bad under the Articles of Confederation. So this was the government that got us through the Revolutionary War and then, up until the time that the Constitution was ratified. So it exposed many of the problems with the national government. It also showed the Founding Fathers that when you give power to the states, which is what the Articles of Confederation did, as I'll talk about here in a minute, and made the national government a weak one, that's not a good idea. And, they saw that, which is why they changed it essentially in the Constitution. The Articles of Confederation also did not help unite the 13 states into the United States because there was a lot of infighting between the states for reasons that I'll talk about here too. So they kept acting like 13 separate states rather than the one United States. So its failure of the Articles of Confederation highlighted some of the problems that were later addressed in the Constitution. So what was the Articles of Confederation? Well, I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll also go through some of the particulars of it. I'm not going to go through all of it, but it's something you can certainly read online. It's not that long of a read. So we talked last week about how the Declaration of Independence was adopted by Congress on July 4th, 1776. So now that we were independent, we had to start a national government to act on behalf of the United States and to represent the United States to the foreign countries in the rest of the world. So in June of 1776, some people were already starting to work on that. even before the Declaration of Independence. But enough of the founding fathers knew that we were likely to declare independence, so we need to have something ready to go if they did. So the first draft of the Articles was not completed until November 15th, 1777. So there was a little bit of time after the Declaration and until the Articles of Confederation was officially adopted on November 15th, 1777. But it wasn't ratified by all of the states, and it had to be. It's written in there that all the states had to ratify it. That didn't happen until Maryland did on March 1st, 1781, which is the same year that the war ended, essentially. So they were just getting all of the states to ratify this was a problem. It took a long time to do that. So the Articles, until the Constitution was ratified, it lasted about 13 years or so from when they first started using it. So the Articles of Confederation, this is where you see the colonies now officially named the United States. And there are 13 articles in the Constitution, in the Articles of Confederation. So before I get into the specifics here, remember what's going on here. We had just broken away from England, who had a strong national government in the form of their parliament. They also had a king as a monarch. So it's not surprising, really, that the founders came up with something that was a weak national government and a strong states government. So I'm going to look at least some of the more important parts here. So in Article 1, this is where the name of the United States of America was given now to the colonies. It also says that the United States is a confederacy. Well, what is that? You probably heard of the Confederacy as part of the Civil War. Well, basically what a confederacy is a political system where the states retain political power except for those that they explicitly give to the national government. So, the states are basically supreme here, not the national government, until the Constitution actually switches that around. But here, under the Articles of Confederation, the states have the power except for that which they explicitly give the national government. Article 2 talks about the states retaining their own sovereignty and their own powers except those that they give away to the national government. Article 3 says that the states are entering into a league of friendship. That's one of the quotes you hear about the Articles. This is a league of friendship amongst the states. And they list 4 main reasons that they're doing this. And some of these, if you've been listening to my show, you'll hear some of these things again that I've talked about before. First one is the common defense of the states. Second one is security of their liberties. Third one was their mutual and general welfare, doing things to better that. And number 4, which is kind of the same as number 1, assisting each state against all force or attacks against the states. So these are some of the reasons for the government that I talked about before, about liberty and freedom, order, and then justice and equality. Those show up in those 4 things. You also see some of these in the preamble to the Constitution that I read earlier. So, the common defense in the Constitution, they say secure the blessings of liberty. Well, here it says security of liberties, right? General welfare is in the Constitution too. So you can see some of the things that are in the Articles show up in the Constitution later. Article 4 gives freedom of travel to the people, so you can go anywhere in the 13 colonies now. You could also trade with all of the 13 different states, open businesses anywhere. They also had the full faith and credit clause for respecting other states' records and judicial proceedings. That full faith and credit clause later shows up in the Constitution in the 4th Amendment. It also has the extradition power in there where Basically, let's say I commit a crime in Massachusetts at the time, and I go to South Carolina to get away, but I get caught. Well, the governor of Massachusetts would send something to the governor of South Carolina to give me back. That's what extradition power is. So that was in Article 4 as well. Now, Article 5 is where they start getting into the structure of the government itself. So each state got one vote. So again, at that time, there were 13 states, so they each got one vote. So there was an odd number, so there wasn't any ties, unless the state didn't vote or something, but it was an odd number of 13. And each state could have between 2 and 7 members in their delegations. So each of those members, don't get a separate vote. The states just get one vote. So if New York wanted to have 7 members, they could. If Rhode Island wanted to have 2 members, they could. But they each only got one vote for their state. And it also contains a speech and debate clause, where if you're up there, talking in Congress, you can basically say whatever you want, short of treason. You can't get prosecuted for a crime, and that also appears in the Constitution. Article 6 lays out things that the states cannot do. So a few of those are like states cannot enter treaties with foreign countries. States cannot start their own wars. And states cannot tax in violation of treaties that the national government would make. So the national government here had powers relating to treaties. So if the states tried to interfere with those, they weren't allowed to under Article 6. I'm skipping Article 7, going to Article 8, which this is where the common treasury was established. And that each state had to pay a certain tax based on the value of land within their state. So whatever that was, they had some formula to figure this out. That is what each state would pay into the national government. And you can imagine some of the problems that happened there, but that's what Article 8 lays out. It doesn't say anything about in there about, well, what happens if they don't pay? And a lot of them didn't pay, as it turns. They were at war too, during the war. And then a lot of states went broke after the war. I'll get to that here in a little bit. This is the one, this is probably the longest one. This is the one that lays out the powers to the new national government. So you'll see that in Article 1 of the Constitution too, where it lays out a bunch of powers for the national government. So some of them were declaring war, having a national army, making treaties, and a lot of people, at least when I'm teaching the American government class, don't know that Congress was actually the first court, if you will. They were like the first Supreme Court, because under the Articles of Confederation, there were no federal court system here. There was no president here. So Article 9 lays out that, Congress is going to be essentially operating as a court to resolve the disputes between the states. The national government can also coin money, make their own money. They can borrow money. And they also regulated the Indian affairs. So those are some of the powers that the national government had. Article 10 said that 9 of the states, so 9 out of the 13, needed to approve laws. So that's more than a majority. That's almost like a supermajority where you needed 9 out of the 13. So that's tough in and of itself to pass laws. And then Article 13, which was the last one, says that all 13 states need to vote to amend the articles. You need all 13 of them. You don't need 9 like you need to pass laws. You need all 13 to amend the Articles of Confederation. So, not surprisingly, they never amended the Articles of Confederation. trying to get 13 states to agree to something back then was, tough and never happened. So there were a lot of problems under the Articles of Confederation. You didn't have any, president or no executive branch. You didn't have a judicial branch. You couldn't tax the people directly. You couldn't tax the states unless they agreed to pay. So a lot of them were going broke. They didn't have any money to pay. So a lot of the founding fathers actually used their own money to keep the government going back then. And of course, the country got into debt with, borrowing money from foreign countries. But a lot of these founders, they went broke trying to keep this government propped up here with their own money. They couldn't tax for a national army. They couldn't regulate commerce. You had 13 different economies. Basically, you had 13 different states. They all had their own economy, and now the national government is going to have its own economy. It turned into a mess. You couldn't maintain order. Shays' Rebellion happened in August of 1786, and this is where some farmers in Massachusetts, I think it was, were storming courthouses because they didn't want to get kicked off their farms. And we nearly came to, shooting on our own people back then. And that was kind of the thing that made the Founding Fathers think that, we got to do something here because this is not maintaining order. They also couldn't get rid of some Spanish people that were still down in Florida and some British people that were still around. They couldn't get rid of them. So it had no real enforcement, mechanisms in there to make the states pay. So those are some of the main problems. And it was because of these many failures that the founders decided that a change was in order. So they feared that the angry masses would take over, which is, what Shays' Rebellion attempted to do. Right? And we know that the Founding Fathers had this fear that the angry masses would take over because there was more of them than there were of the founders. So they ultimately, this fear and these problems with the Articles of Confederation ultimately led to the Constitution being brought up at the Constitutional Convention to come up with a brand new government because this one that we had just wasn't working. So next week I'm going to start getting into the Constitution. So you have been listening to Politics Matters with Bruce Klopfleisch here on the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. So now you know what the Articles of Confederation is. Come back after the break, and I'm going to talk about the Supreme Court yet again. Welcome back to AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota, for the final segment of today's show of Politics Matters with Bruce Klopfleisch. If you would like to comment or have a question, email it to comment@am950radio.com. So I'm going to do it again. Time for another segment about the Supreme Court. I've talked about them before on previous shows, and I'm going to do it again. And I have a feeling I'm going to be doing it in the future too. But why do I keep talking about the Supreme Court? Well, I think the Supreme Court is becoming out of control. It's no secret why the approval ratings for this court are at all-time lows. I talked before about how there's an obvious conflict of interest with Justices Alito and Thomas and how they're getting potentially illegal financial benefits, or bribes as I like to call it, from right-wing billionaires. There's been another thing about Thomas that has come up, so I'll get to that here in a minute. But the Senate Judiciary Committee has referred these sketchy financial dealings to the Department of Justice for an investigation of possible tax law violations or other crimes. Although I don't think that Merrick Garland, our Attorney General, I don't think he has the stomach to charge two sitting Supreme Court justices. So I don't know that it's going to go anywhere. But it's still out there. People are still learning, more about this. Another thing is the Supreme Court basically said, "Oh, here, this is our own code of ethics," because they were getting, a lot of bad publicity for that. Well, Their code of ethics is weak, and there's no enforcement mechanism in that thing. And when there's no enforcement of anything, they're just going to keep doing what they're doing. And I think the Republican justices have learned that they can basically do what they want and get away with it. The other federal court justices have a code of ethics that is much stronger than what the Supreme Court has. John Roberts, the Chief Justice, refuses to testify in Congress about this. These actions, along with their numerous 6-3 Republican favoring decisions every term, has led Americans to realize that these 6 Republicans are in the bag for the Republican Party and the wealthy in corporate America. And their decisions this last term has certainly shown that, and even on the last couple terms. So the reversal of Roe versus Wade is one. The strange presidential immunity decision that they came out with in the beginning of July, and a case where a lot of people don't know about, but there was a case called Chevron, which was, I think, back for about 40 years ago. This is where the Supreme Court said, well, we're going to defer to the agencies on a lot of these tough, complicated regulatory issues. Republicans hated that case. They've been trying for 40 years to get that thrown out and say, well, and let judges decide that instead of the regulatory agencies. And that's what the Supreme Court did. The Republicans got their dream now. So now you're going to get a lot of uneducated Republican judges because they're going to file all these cases in the Republican areas, right? That know nothing about a lot of these regulatory issues, and they're going to be the ones deciding. It's just bad news, and it's going to change the way we have our administrative side of our government. So in response, President Biden recently proposed 3 changes to the Supreme Court. And this comes on the heels, by the way, of Clarence Thomas getting caught again for not disclosing flights that a billionaire Republican by the name of Harlan Crow paid for. I said this before, and I'll say it again. I suspect there's even more of these that Clarence Thomas hasn't reported, and probably Samuel Alito as well. So here's another one that Clarence Thomas just got caught on not reporting. So the first proposal is an 18-year term limit for the justices, with each president appointing somebody new every 2 years. So at the end of the 18 years, they would be cycled out. New one would take over. I think part of the approach here is, 18 years is long enough. This was the average term length. If you go back in our history from the founding up to 1970, this 18 years was the average length that a justice served. From 1970 on, because they're much younger now and when they're being appointed, it's been 28 years. That's the average length. So, plus they're trying to get the politics out of this, where it doesn't matter who the president is, they're going to get a pick, at least one pick. Now, if someone dies while in office and things, well, yeah, then you're going to get, more than one. But this is an attempt, at least, to put a term limit on them and kind of take some of the politics out of it, because the political thing has really gotten bad now with picking Supreme Court justices and federal judges, for that matter. But this isn't going to go anywhere, because right now, at least, the Republicans control the House of Representatives, and they're not going to pass this. So, again, we got to take the House, the Senate, and the presidency in this next election to get some of this stuff done. Plus, it might take a constitutional amendment to do this, since in the Constitution, all federal judges serve for a lifetime appointment, unless they're impeached. So setting a term limit of 18 years, and then having them leave, I think you might need a constitutional amendment to do that rather than a law passed by Congress. But one way around this, I think, is to just take them off the Supreme Court after 18 years and let them still be a senior federal court judge hearing other cases. They're just not going to be on the Supreme Court anymore. So I think that's a way to potentially get around needing to amend the Constitution. Because in order to amend the Constitution, you need 2/3 vote of Congress or 2/3 votes of the states to just propose one. And then you need 3/4 of the states to ratify it. And, that's a high bar. That ain't going to happen either. So the second proposal was to enforce an ethics code. So basically, I think here it is, Supreme Court, you should have the same ethics code as the other federal judges, basically, is I think what it comes down to here. So this would require disclosing gifts, refraining from public political activity, and recusing themselves, meaning they take themselves off of cases in which they or their spouses have a financial or other conflicts of interest. But here again, you run into the problem of the House is not going to deal with this right now. The third proposal is for a constitutional amendment reversing the presidential immunity decision so that a president is not immune for crimes committed while in office. Remember, their decision is basically when a president is in office, as long as it's an official act, whatever that means, the president is immune, even if it's a crime. So he's proposing a constitutional amendment to reverse that. And again, that's probably not going to fly because you're not going to get 2/3 of Congress or 2/3 of the states to propose this. And even if you do, let's just assume that you do, you got to still get 3/4 of the state to ratify it, and that's going to be tough to do. So if Biden and his people know that none of this is probably going to happen, well, why are they doing it? Well, I think that they're making the Supreme Court a campaign issue, and rightly so. I think the Supreme Court is grabbing power that it doesn't have under the Constitution, and they need to get stopped and put back in their place a little bit here. So the Democrats don't like these partisan decisions which are coming out of the Supreme Court, and again, it's 6-3 Republicans. And it's going to be tough to turn that around to Democrats, in a short period of time. So we're going to be stuck with this stuff. So, and I also think that if by the Republicans having the 6-3 the Supreme Court, they're just imposing minority rule on this country because a lot of their decisions are against what the majority of people want. But they don't care. They're just going to keep doing what the Republican Party wants them to do. Now, some people may disagree with me about that, but if you look at the decisions, it's pretty clear what they're doing. Some other proposals floating around are putting an age limit on the justices on the Supreme Court. Some states have that, like Minnesota. Once you hit 70, you're done as a judge in Minnesota, because that's a law that we have here. So they could try something like that for the Supreme Court. But here again, the Constitution says it's a lifetime appointment. So you probably got to amend the Constitution or say again here, well, when you turn 70, you can go hear other federal cases. You just can't be on the Supreme Court, hearing those cases anymore. Another one I mentioned before is about adding justices. Right now we have 9. There's proposals out there to add it to 13 because there's 13 federal court circuits out there now. So adding justices could work, but here again, the Democrats need to control the House and the Senate and the presidency to do that. And let's be honest here. If they did it, if the Republicans get in control, they can do the same thing too. So if the Republicans win the presidency, the House, and the Senate in this next election, and let's hope they don't, they could, if they wanted to, try and say, okay, well, the Democrats wanted to do this. Well, we're going to do this. We're going to raise it up to 13, and Trump's going to appoint all, more crazy people to the Supreme Court. So, that's something you got to kind of watch for too. Not surprisingly, after these proposals came out, a justice has told Biden to, quote, be careful, close quote, with these proposals, whatever that means. So Justice Neil Gorsuch, he's out hawking his new book on Fox News. Now, you can certainly question whether a sitting Supreme Court judge should be going out on Fox News. and talking about cases and stuff that has been out there, and there was even some political stuff in there. This be careful stuff. People are saying, well, this was a threat, and some people are like, well, nah, he didn't really mean that as a threat, but take it for whatever it's worth. But in the same interview, and I think this is the more important part of the interview, Gorsuch said that people want to have independent judges and get a fair shake by the Supreme Court. Yeah, we do. But this current Supreme Court is not independent. They're in the bag for the Republican Party. They're in the bag for the rich and the wealthy people, big corporations. And here again, just look at their decisions, and you can see it. It's as clear as day. So this Supreme Court is breaking precedent. During their Senate hearings, they're saying, I'm going to abide by precedent. Well, they're breaking it. They broke it with Roe versus Wade, a 50-year precedent. They broke it with Chevron, a 40-year precedent. What are they going to break next? And they're making up facts to support their reasoning here. So judges need to be independent from political parties. But a lot of it is, they're certainly not anymore. There was a time where they were, but now everything's political. And the special interest groups and the big money groups are throwing money at them too, to get them elected or get them nominated and then elected by the Senate. So what part of the problem that we're running into is that the people follow judicial opinions, even if they don't like them. This is a problem now because the people are not respecting this current Supreme Court with the decisions. Their respect is now waning for them, and they're at an all-time low with their ratings. So this is definitely a campaign issue in the next election. And if the Democrats win, they can try and do some reform, but the Republicans certainly aren't going to do it. And then the last part is, well, if you try and do something, it's going to end up in front of the Supreme Court because they'll get appealed up there. So we'll see how that works out. Thanks for listening to Politics Matters. Talk to you next week about the Constitution, among other things. See you then.